Elena Marsh felt a hand close around her arm before she even understood what was happening. The grip was hard, meant to hurt just enough to make a point. Around her, the ballroom fell into a hush so sudden it felt like the music itself had been slapped into silence. Every face turned toward her. Every pair of eyes carried the same cold judgment. "Remove her," said the man standing in front of her, his voice flat and final, as if he were ordering a servant to sweep away a broken plate. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked up into the face of Duke Alexander Whitmore, the most powerful man in the region, and saw nothing there that resembled mercy. His jaw was tight. His gray eyes moved over her borrowed gown, her plain hair, her trembling hands, cataloging every detail that marked her as someone who did not belong. "I was invited," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "My cousin Margaret brought me. I have done nothing wrong." "You have done everything wrong simply by walking through that door," the Duke said. "Girls like you do not attend balls like this. You come here hunting for a title, for money, for anything you can take. I have seen it before, and I will not allow it to happen under my roof." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, cruel and quiet, the kind of laughter that people hide behind gloved hands. Elena felt her face burn, but she refused to let her eyes drop. She thought of her mother, who stitched dresses late into the night so that other women could look beautiful at parties they would never be invited to. She thought of every door that had ever been closed in her face simply because of the name she carried. "You do not know anything about me," she said quietly. "I know enough," the Duke answered, and he nodded to the footman at his side. "See her out now." The footman's grip tightened, and Elena had no choice but to move. She kept her chin lifted as she walked, though her legs felt unsteady beneath the weight of 100 watching eyes. The ballroom seemed impossibly long, a stretch of polished marble and glittering chandeliers that led toward the great front doors and the humiliation waiting beyond them. She could hear whispers trailing behind her like smoke, words she did not need to understand clearly to feel their sting. Margaret tried to push through the crowd toward her, but a second footman blocked her path, murmuring something about not causing a scene. Elena caught her cousin's horrified expression for only a moment before she was turned toward the exit again. Then from somewhere above, a voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through silk. "Wait!" The single word carried an authority that startled everyone, including the Duke. Heads turned upward, toward the wide staircase that curved along the far wall of the ballroom. At the top of it stood a young woman in a pale blue gown, her hand resting lightly on the banister, her head tilted in a way that suggested she was listening rather than looking. Her eyes, Elena noticed even from a distance, did not quite focus on anything in the room. "Serafina," the Duke said, and for the first time that evening, something other than coldness moved across his features. It looked almost like alarm. "Bring her to me," Serafina said. "The girl your men are dragging toward the door. Bring her to me now." "This does not concern you," Alexander said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "It concerns me a great deal," Serafina answered, and she began descending the stairs with slow, careful steps, one hand trailing along the rail. "I have been sitting here for the better part of an hour, listening to this ball the way I listen to everything, because listening is all I have left. And in all that time, this is the only voice in this room that has sounded honest to me." A murmur rolled through the crowd again, but this time it was different, uncertain, curious. The footman holding Elena's arm loosened his grip slightly, unsure what to do without a clear command. "Serafina, this is not the time," Alexander said, moving toward his sister as if to guide her away from the situation entirely. "It is exactly the time," Serafina said, and she reached the bottom of the stairs, turning her face toward the sound of her brother's voice with a calm that felt, to Elena, almost otherworldly. "I have sat through a dozen of these balls, Alexander. I have listened to 100 women speak to you, and every one of them sounded the same. Practiced, careful, hungry for something, but this girl's voice was different. It shook. It was afraid, and still she did not lie to you." Elena stood frozen, uncertain whether she was meant to speak, uncertain whether anything she said would matter at all. The footman had released her arm entirely now, stepping back as though the situation had grown too complicated for him to manage alone. "You cannot possibly know that from a voice alone," Alexander said, though his tone had shifted, edged now with something closer to discomfort than command. "I know it precisely because I only have voices," Serafina said. "I have spent years learning to hear what people hide behind their words. You have spent your whole life watching faces, and you still cannot tell when someone is lying to you. I would trust my ears over your eyes any day, brother." A few nervous laughs rose from the onlookers, quickly smothered. The Duke's expression darkened, though whether from embarrassment or something else, Alina could not tell. "Please," Serafina said, and now she turned her unseeing eyes toward where Alina stood, as if she could feel exactly where the young woman was positioned in the room. "Come here. Let me speak with you properly, away from all these people who seem far too interested in watching someone else's humiliation." Alina hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. She was aware of every eye still fixed on her, aware of the whispers that would follow her long after this night ended, but there was something in Serafina's voice that made the fear loosen its grip on her chest, if only slightly. "I am Alina," she said softly as she approached. "I know," Serafina said, and for the first time that evening she smiled. "I heard your cousin say your name earlier when she was trying to convince the footman to leave you alone. Alina Marsh, it suits you, simple and strong." Alexander stepped closer, his voice low and urgent now, meant only for his sister. "Serafina, you do not know this girl. You cannot simply pull strangers out of a crowd because their voice pleases you. And you cannot simply throw people out of your home because their dress does not please you," Serafina replied without hesitation, and the words landed with enough force that several guests nearby audibly caught their breath. The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Alina watched the muscles in his face work, watched him weigh his sister's words against his own pride, and watched him lose that particular battle, even if he was not yet willing to admit defeat aloud. "Fine," he said finally, his voice clipped. "She may stay a moment longer. But this changes nothing about my assessment of the situation." "Of course it does not," Serafina said, her tone carrying the faintest note of amusement, as though she had heard this exact kind of stubbornness from her brother many times before. She reached out, unerringly finding Alina's hand, and closed her fingers around it with surprising gentleness. "Come, sit with me somewhere quieter. I find I have very little patience left for crowded rooms tonight." Alina glanced toward Margaret, who was staring at the scene with an expression somewhere between disbelief and relief, and toward the Duke, whose eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity she could not quite name. Then she allowed Serafina to lead her away from the center of the ballroom, toward a quieter alcove near the tall windows, leaving behind a room full of whispers that would not settle for hours. As they walked, Serafina kept her hand loosely wrapped around Alina's arm, not for guidance in the way Alina expected, but almost as though she wanted the physical connection to remain, as if letting go might allow the moment and the person beside her to slip away entirely. "You must think I am strange," Serafina said once they had settled onto a cushioned bench tucked into the alcove, half hidden by heavy velvet curtains. The noise of the ballroom faded into a distant hum here, and for the first time that night, Alina felt she could breathe properly. "I think you are the first kind thing that has happened to me all evening," Alina admitted. Serafina laughed softly, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. "That is a low standard for kindness, considering my brother's behavior tonight. I apologize for him. He was not always like this, you know. He seems very certain of himself." "He is very certain of very little," Serafina said, and there was a weight behind the words that suggested history Alina did not yet understand. "He simply hides his uncertainty behind sharp words and colder eyes. It is easier than admitting he does not know how to trust anyone anymore." Alina studied the young woman beside her, taking in the delicate features so similar to her brother's, though softened by an openness his face entirely lacked. Serafina's eyes, pale and slightly unfocused, drifted toward the sound of Alina's voice whenever she spoke, as though tracking her the way sighted people might track a face. "How long have you been unable to see?" Alina asked, then immediately regretted the question, worried it might be too forward, too painful. But Serafina only shrugged lightly. "Almost 6 years now. There was an illness, a fever that nearly took my life along with my sight. I have grown used to the darkness. In some ways, I have grown to prefer it. People show me who they truly are through their voices, their pauses, the way their words tremble or steady themselves. It is much harder to hide from someone who cannot be distracted by appearances." "And what did my voice tell you?" Alina asked, curious despite herself. Serafina tilted her head, considering the question seriously. "It told me you were frightened but not desperate. There is a difference, you know. Desperate people beg. Frightened people simply try to hold their ground. You held yours, even when my brother tried to strip it away from you in front of everyone." Alina felt something loosen in her chest at those words, some knot of humiliation she had been carrying since the moment the footman's hand closed around her arm. "I did not think anyone noticed anything except the dress I was wearing, and the fact that I clearly did not belong among all this." "I noticed everything else," Serafina said simply. "The dress means nothing to me. I cannot see it, and even if I could, I would not care. What I care about is whether a person's heart matches their words. Yours did." For a while, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them felt oddly comfortable, filled only by the distant murmur of the ball continuing without them. Alina found herself studying the strange girl beside her, wondering how someone who had lost so much could speak with such quiet confidence, such certainty in her own perception of the world. "Tell me about yourself," Serafina said eventually. "Not the version you think I want to hear, the true one." And so Alina did. She spoke of her mother's small shop, tucked into a narrow street where the wealthy rarely walked, where fabric scraps littered the floor and the smell of thread and dye lingered in every corner. She spoke of long nights spent helping her mother finish gowns for women who would never remember her face, women who treated her mother as though she were part of the furniture rather than the reason their dresses fit so beautifully. She spoke of her father, gone since she was young, and the quiet, constant effort it took to hold a household together on so little. Serafina listened without interrupting, her head tilted slightly, absorbing every word as though it were a piece of music she wanted to memorize. When Alina finally fell silent, unsure how much more to share, Serafina squeezed her hand gently. "You have had a harder life than most people in that ballroom will ever understand," she said, "and yet you speak of it without bitterness. That is rare, Alina, rarer than you know." "There did not seem to be much point in bitterness," Alina said. "It does not put food on the table or thread through a needle." Serafina smiled at that, a small, private smile that seemed to hold more warmth than anything Alina had witnessed in the entire ballroom that night. "I think I would like to know you better, if you would allow it. It has been a very long time since I have had a friend who spoke to me honestly, rather than carefully." Alina hesitated, glancing back toward the distant lights of the ballroom, where she could just make out the tall, rigid figure of the Duke standing near the staircase, his attention fixed in their direction even from across the room. She wondered what it would mean to accept this strange, sudden offer of friendship from the sister of the man who had humiliated her so publicly only minutes before. "I would like that," she said finally, and meant it. "Good," Serafina said, satisfaction clear in her voice. "Then let us begin properly. Tell me something about yourself that no one else in that ballroom knows. Something small, something true." Alina thought for a moment, then found herself smiling despite everything that had happened that night. "I hum while I sew. My mother says I have done it since I was a child. I do not even notice I am doing it until someone points it out." "What do you hum?" "Whatever comes to mind. Sometimes songs I have heard at church. Sometimes nothing at all, just sounds that feel right in the moment." Serafina laughed, delighted. "I would like to hear that sometime. A voice that shakes when frightened and hums without noticing when it is calm. You are full of contradictions, Alina Marsh." "I could say the same of this evening," Alina replied. I came here expecting to admire a beautiful room from a safe distance and quietly disappear before anyone noticed me. Instead, I was thrown out in front of everyone. And now, I am sitting here speaking with the one person in this house who seems to have no interest in judging me at all. Life rarely goes the way we expect, Serafina said. I certainly never expected to lose my sight at 17, and yet here I am, hearing the world more clearly than I ever did when I could see it. Across the ballroom, the orchestra shifted into a new song, and the murmur of conversation rose and fell like waves against a shore. Elena could still feel the weight of the stares that had followed her earlier, still feel the sting of the Duke's cold dismissal, but sitting beside Serafina in the quiet alcove, those feelings had softened into something more distant, more bearable. She did not yet know that this single conversation would change the course of her life entirely, would draw her deeper into the world of the Whitmore family than she could possibly imagine, and would eventually force the Duke himself to confront every assumption he had ever made about people like her. She did not know that the very sister he had tried to protect from disappointment would become the reason his carefully guarded heart began, slowly and reluctantly, to open. For now, she knew only this, that a girl who could not see had somehow seen her more clearly than anyone else in that glittering, judgmental room, and that small, unexpected kindness felt like the first true light of the entire evening. "Will you come again?" Serafina asked as the conversation began to wind down, her voice carrying a note of hope she did not try to hide. "Not to the ball. I do not think my brother's pride could survive that twice in one night, but to visit me properly in the daylight, when there is no music to hide behind and no crowd to perform for." Elena thought of her mother's shop, of the hours of work waiting for her the next morning, of the impossible gap between her small, humble life and the grand world of the Whitmore estate. And yet, looking at Serafina's hopeful expression, she found she could not bring herself to refuse. "I would like that very much," she said. Neither of them noticed the tall figure who had drawn closer during their conversation, standing just beyond the curtain, listening with an expression that had shifted, slowly and against his will, from irritation into something far more complicated. Alexander Whitmore had come to pull his sister away from a stranger he still did not trust. Instead, he found himself unable to move, caught by the sound of his sister's laughter, a sound he had not heard in longer than he cared to admit. He did not yet understand what this evening had set into motion. He only knew, standing there in the shadow of the curtain, that something inside the rigid certainty he had built around himself had cracked, just slightly, and he was not entirely sure how to put it back together again. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay awake long after Margaret had returned from the ball, listening to her cousin whisper apologies through the thin wall that separated their two narrow beds, insisting she had tried everything to stop the footman, that she never imagined the evening would end the way it had. Elena told her honestly that there was nothing to forgive. The blame did not belong to Margaret. It belonged to a world that measured a person's worth by the cut of their gown and the weight of their family name. By morning, the memory of the humiliation had dulled slightly, worn smooth by exhaustion, but the memory of Serafina's voice remained sharp and clear, untouched by the passing hours. Elena rose before dawn as she always did, pulling on her work dress and tying back her hair, and made her way down to the small shop where her mother was already bent over a length of pale green silk, needle flashing in the early light. "You are quiet this morning," her mother said without looking up, her fingers moving with the practiced ease of 20 years at the craft. "Margaret told me what happened at the estate." Elena hesitated, unsure how much detail to share, unwilling to relive the sharp sting of the Duke's words in front of her mother, who worked so hard to give her even the smallest chances at a better life. "It was not a pleasant evening," she said carefully. Her mother set down her needle and looked at her properly for the first time, taking in the shadows beneath her daughter's eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "Tell me." So Elena told her everything, the cold dismissal, the humiliating walk toward the door in front of 100 watching strangers. And then, softening her voice as she reached the part of the story that still felt unreal even to her, the sudden intervention of a blind young woman who had somehow heard something true in her voice from all the way across a crowded room. Her mother listened in silence, her hand still resting on the unfinished silk, and when Alina finished, she let out a long breath. "The Duke's sister," she murmured. "I have heard of her, Lady Seraphina. They say she has not attended a proper social event in years, not since the illness took her sight. It is strange that she would come down for you." "She said my voice sounded honest," Alina said, still turning the memory over in her mind as though examining a stone for hidden facets. "She asked me to visit her." Her mother's eyebrows lifted, surprise and something like caution flickering across her tired face. "And will you?" Alina thought of the alcove, the quiet warmth of Seraphina's hand wrapped around her own, the genuine curiosity in her voice as she asked question after question about Alina's ordinary life, as though it were the most fascinating thing she had encountered in years. She thought, too, of the Duke's cold gray eyes, the absolute certainty in his voice as he ordered her removed from his home, and the strange, unreadable expression that had crossed his face just before she was led away into the quiet alcove with his sister. "I told her I would," Alina admitted. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the first carts of the morning were beginning to rattle along the cobblestones outside. "Be careful, Alina. Families like the Whitmores do not open their doors to girls like us without reason, and reasons are not always kind ones. The Duke humiliated you in front of everyone last night. I would not trust his household so easily, no matter how sweetly his sister spoke to you." "I do not trust the Duke," Alina said. "But Seraphina is not her brother." "No," her mother agreed slowly. "But she lives inside his walls, under his protection, and whatever kindness she offers you will always exist within the shadow of his authority. Remember that, before you allow yourself to hope for too much." Alina nodded, though privately she could not quite shake the memory of Seraphina's laughter, warm and unguarded, or the way she had reached for Alina's hand as though she had been waiting a long time for someone to simply speak to her honestly. Whatever caution her mother's words carried, Alina found she could not regret the promise she had made. 3 days passed before she found the courage to walk the long road toward the Whitmore estate again, this time in the plain, sturdy dress she wore for deliveries, carrying a small basket of mending her mother had finished for one of the estate's housekeepers, a convenient excuse that would allow her through the servant's entrance without drawing unwanted attention. Her heart pounded harder with every step, memories of the humiliating walk through the ballroom rising unbidden with each turn in the road. The housekeeper who answered the servant's door, a stern-faced woman named Clara with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, studied Alina for a long moment before recognition dawned in her eyes. "You are the girl from the ball," Clara said, not unkindly, though her tone carried a note of surprise. "Lady Seraphina has asked after you every day since. I did not think you would actually come." "I told her I would," Alina said simply. Clara studied her a moment longer, then stepped back to allow her through the doorway. "She is in the garden this morning. It is her favorite place, especially when the weather is fine. She says she can hear the birds more clearly out there, away from the walls." Alina followed the housekeeper through a maze of quiet corridors, past rooms far grander than anything she had ever set foot in, their walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch her passage, with the same suspicion she had encountered on the night of the ball. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to let the grandeur of the house intimidate her, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. They emerged through a set of tall glass doors into a garden bursting with color, roses climbing along trellises, neat hedges bordering winding gravel paths, and at the center of it all, seated on a stone bench beneath a wide, spreading tree, sat Seraphina, her face tilted toward the morning sun, an expression of quiet contentment softening her features. "I hear footsteps that are not familiar," Seraphina said before Clara could announce their arrival, a small smile already tugging at the corner of her mouth. "But I think I recognize the rhythm of them." "Alina." "It is me," Alina confirmed, warmth spreading through her chest at the obvious delight in Seraphina's voice. You came, Serafina said, rising from the bench and reaching out, her hands finding Alina's with practiced ease, as though she had already memorized the exact distance and direction. I was beginning to think I had imagined the entire conversation, or that you had decided I was far too strange to bother with a second visit. You are not strange, Alina said, laughing despite herself. You are the kindest person I met that entire evening. That is a very low standard, considering the company, Serafina replied, echoing her own words from days before, and both women laughed together, the sound mingling easily with the birdsong drifting through the garden. Clara withdrew quietly, leaving the two of them alone among the roses, and for a long while they simply talked, filling the space between them with easy conversation that felt, to Alina's surprise, as natural as speaking with an old friend rather than someone she had known for only a handful of days. Serafina asked about the shop, about the customers who came through its narrow door, about the specific feeling of silk against skin compared to wool, questions that revealed a hunger for detail that came, Alina realized, from a life spent building the world through senses other than sight. Tell me what the roses look like, Serafina said at one point, reaching out to brush her fingers gently against a nearby bloom. I know their scent, and I know their softness, but I have not seen color in 6 years, and sometimes I forget exactly how to picture it. Alina considered the question carefully, wanting to give an answer worthy of the trust behind it. This one is a deep red, almost the color of wine when the light catches it just right. The petals curl inward at the center, tighter and tighter, like a secret folding in on itself, before they open wide at the edges. Serafina was quiet for a moment, her fingers still resting against the velvet petals, a faraway expression crossing her face. A secret folding in on itself, she repeated softly. I like that description very much. You have a way with words, Alina. Have you ever considered writing? I have never had the time, Alina admitted. Between the shop and helping my mother, there is very little room left for anything else. That seems a great waste, Serafina said, though I suppose most of us spend our lives doing what necessity demands rather than what our hearts might prefer. They continued walking through the garden as they talked, Serafina's hand resting lightly on Alina's arm for guidance, though it quickly became clear that she knew every path and turn by memory, her steps sure and confident despite her darkened world. It was during this walk that Alina first noticed the tall figure standing near the edge of the garden, half hidden by the shade of a large oak tree, watching them with an expression she could not quite read from such a distance. Your brother is watching us, she said quietly, unsure whether to feel alarmed or simply curious. Serafina's expression shifted slightly, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. He does that quite often lately, ever since the ball. He thinks I do not notice, but I hear him. He walks differently than usual when he is uncertain about something, slower, more careful, as though he is trying not to disturb whatever he is observing. Perhaps he is worried you have brought a stranger into his home, Alina said. Perhaps, Serafina agreed. Or perhaps he is worried about something else entirely, something he has not yet found the courage to admit, even to himself. Alina glanced again toward the shadowed figure beneath the oak tree, and for a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance of the garden. The Duke did not look away immediately, as she might have expected. Instead, he held her gaze for several long seconds, his expression unreadable, before turning abruptly and disappearing back into the house, leaving Alina with a strange, unsettled feeling she could not quite name. He is not an easy man to understand, Serafina said, as though reading the thoughts trailing through Alina's mind. But he was not always so guarded. There was a time, before our parents passed, and before certain other events took their toll on him, when he laughed freely and trusted easily. I sometimes wonder if that version of him still exists somewhere beneath all the coldness he has built around himself. What happened to change him? Alina asked, curiosity overtaking her caution. Serafina's expression grew more serious, and for a moment she said nothing, her fingers tightening slightly around Alina's arm. That is a story for another day, I think. It is not entirely mine to tell, and I would not want to share it carelessly, even with someone I already trust as much as I trust you." Alina nodded, respecting the boundary even as her curiosity lingered, unanswered. They continued their walk in comfortable silence for a while longer, until the sun began climbing higher and Alina reluctantly reminded herself of the hours of work still waiting for her back at the shop. "You will come again?" Serafina asked as they made their way back toward the house, her voice carrying the same hopeful note it had held during their first conversation. "As often as I can," Alina promised, and meant it fully, despite her mother's earlier warnings, despite the unsettling weight of the Duke's watchful gaze still lingering in her memory. As she made her way back down the long road toward home that afternoon, her basket empty and her heart strangely lighter than it had been in a very long time, Alina found herself thinking not of the humiliation she had suffered at the ball, but of the roses, the birdsong, and the quiet, growing certainty that her life had shifted onto a path she could never have predicted, one that led, whether she was ready for it or not, directly toward the guarded, complicated heart of Duke Alexander Whitmore himself. She did not yet know how deeply that path would test her, nor how many obstacles still lay hidden along its winding course, waiting to reveal themselves in the weeks to come. The visits became a habit long before Alina allowed herself to admit it as one. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times when her mother could spare her from the shop, she made the long walk to the Whitmore estate, always through the servants' entrance, always with some small excuse tucked into her basket, though Clara had long since stopped asking for reasons, and simply waved her through with a knowing look that Alina chose not to examine too closely. Serafina's world, she discovered, was far richer than most people would have guessed from a passing glance at the quiet, unassuming young woman who rarely left the estate grounds. She had memorized the sound of every fountain, every creaking floorboard, every particular bird call that visited the garden in different seasons. She could identify servants by the rhythm of their footsteps alone, and she had strong, often amusing opinions about which of them she trusted and which she did not. "Old Mr. Ferris walks like he is carrying a great secret," she told Alina one afternoon as they sat together near the fountain, the water trickling pleasantly behind them. "Very slow, very careful, as though he is afraid of dropping something important. I have never caught him at anything, mind you, but I remain suspicious." "Perhaps he simply has sore knees," Alina suggested, laughing. "Perhaps," Serafina allowed, though her tone made clear she preferred her own theory. "And you, Alina, walk like someone who has spent her whole life trying not to take up too much space. Quick, light steps, always ready to move aside for someone else. I noticed it the very first time you walked toward me in the garden." Alina considered this observation for a long moment, surprised by how accurately it captured something she had never articulated even to herself. "I suppose that is true. It is difficult not to walk that way when the world has spent so long reminding you where you belong and where you do not." "I hope that changes for you," Serafina said softly, reaching over to find Alina's hand and give it a gentle squeeze. "You deserve to take up space, Alina. As much space as anyone else in this world, regardless of what your birth certificate says about your family's name." These small moments of tenderness had become the quiet foundation of their growing friendship, but Alina could not ignore the way the atmosphere of the estate shifted whenever the Duke was near. He had not spoken to her directly since the night of the ball, though she often felt his presence lingering at the edges of her visits, a shadow observing from windows, a figure glimpsed at the end of a corridor, always watching, never approaching. It was during one such visit, as autumn began settling its cooler breath over the garden, and the roses began to fade toward their final blooms of the season, that Alina finally found herself face to face with him again, without his sister present to soften the tension between them. She had been sent to fetch a shawl for Serafina from the sitting room, a small errand that should have taken only a few minutes, when she rounded a corner and nearly collided directly with the Duke himself, who was emerging from his study with a stack of papers tucked beneath one arm. Both of them froze, startled into silence for a long moment. Alina felt her pulse quicken, memories of the ballroom humiliation rising sharply in her mind. though this time there was no crowd of onlookers, no cruel laughter waiting in the wings. "Miss Marsh," the Duke said finally, his voice carrying none of the icy authority she remembered from their first encounter, though it remained guarded, careful. "Your Grace," Elena replied, dipping into a small, formal curtsy out of habit, though something about the gesture felt oddly hollow given everything that had happened between them. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, neither quite certain how to proceed. Elena expected him to dismiss her, to remind her once again of her place within his household. But instead, he simply studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes carrying an expression far more complicated than the cold judgment she remembered from the ball. "My sister speaks of you often," he said eventually, "more than she has spoken of anyone in a very long time." "She has been very kind to me," Elena said carefully, unsure of the ground she was standing on. "She rarely extends that kindness so freely," Alexander said, and there was something almost like curiosity in his tone now, replacing the earlier coldness. "I confess I do not entirely understand it. Perhaps she simply recognizes something in people that others overlook," Elena said, allowing a small edge to creep into her voice, unable to entirely resist the memory of how thoroughly he had overlooked her worth on the night they first met. The Duke's expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been guilt, though he masked it quickly behind his usual composure. "I owe you an apology for that evening," he said, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "My behavior was ungenerous." Elena blinked, startled by the admission, though she quickly recovered her composure. "Ungenerous is a very gentle word for humiliating someone in front of an entire ballroom, Your Grace." To her surprise, a faint, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it at all. "You do not soften your words, Miss Marsh." "I have found that softened words rarely change anything," Elena replied. "They simply make the person speaking them feel better about not saying what they truly mean." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the distinct impression that he was recalculating something, adjusting whatever assumptions he had carried about her since that first cruel dismissal. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "Nor are you," Elena admitted, thinking of the warmth she had witnessed between him and his sister in quiet, unguarded moments, glimpsed from a distance, so at odds with the cold authority he had displayed at the ball. Before either of them could say anything further, the sound of Serafina's voice calling from down the corridor broke the strange tension that had built between them. "Elena, did you get lost finding my shawl?" "I should go," Elena said, grateful for the interruption despite the odd reluctance she felt to end the conversation entirely. "Of course," the Duke said, stepping aside to let her pass, though his eyes followed her a moment longer than strictly necessary before he turned and continued down the corridor in the opposite direction. Elena found the shawl and hurried back to the garden, her mind still turning over the strange exchange, the unexpected apology, the flicker of something almost human beneath the Duke's carefully constructed armor. Serafina, of course, noticed the change in her mood immediately. "You have had an encounter with my brother," she said the moment Elena settled the shawl around her shoulders, her tone carrying unmistakable amusement. "How could you possibly know that?" Elena asked, startled. "Your breathing changed the moment you walked through the door," Serafina said matter-of-factly. "Quicker, shallower, the way people breathe when they are still processing something unexpected, and you took longer than a simple errand should require." "What did he say to you?" Elena hesitated, unsure how much to share, though she quickly realized there was very little point in trying to keep secrets from someone whose perception seemed to extend far beyond mere sight. "He apologized for the ball." Serafina went very still for a moment, genuine surprise crossing her features. "He apologized to you directly." "Is that so unusual?" "Alexander does not apologize," Serafina said slowly, as though testing the truth of her own words. "Not to anyone, not for anything, not since our parents died. I cannot remember the last time I heard him admit fault for something so directly." She paused, her expression thoughtful. You must have made quite an impression on him, Alina, whether either of you realizes it yet. Alina felt heat rising in her cheeks at the implication behind Serafina's words, though she quickly tried to dismiss it. I am sure it was simply guilt over embarrassing his sister's guest in front of half the county. Perhaps, Serafina said, though her tone remained skeptical, and a small, knowing smile lingered on her lips for the remainder of the visit, one that Alina chose, quite deliberately, not to examine too closely. The weeks that followed brought a slow, cautious shift in the atmosphere of the estate. The Duke no longer disappeared entirely at the sight of Alina, though their conversations remained brief and carefully guarded, exchanges of polite words that nevertheless carried an undercurrent of something neither of them was quite ready to name. Alina found herself, against every instinct of caution her mother had instilled in her, looking forward to these small, unexpected encounters as much as she looked forward to her afternoons with Serafina. It was during one of these encounters, in the estate's modest library, that Alina finally learned a piece of the story Serafina had refused to share weeks earlier. She had come to return a book Serafina had asked her to read aloud during a previous visit, and found the Duke there instead, seated near the window with a ledger spread across his lap, though his attention seemed far from the numbers in front of him. You read to her, he said, not quite a question, as Alina set the book down on a nearby table. She enjoys stories, Alina said, especially ones with adventure in them. She says they let her imagination travel places her feet cannot. Something softened in the Duke's expression at this, a rare, unguarded moment that Alina found herself studying with more attention than she probably should have. She used to read constantly before the illness. I would find her curled into corners of this very library for hours, completely lost in whatever story had captured her attention that week. It must have been very difficult for her, losing that, Alina said gently. It was difficult for all of us, Alexander said, and something in his voice carried a weight that suggested there was far more to the story than a simple childhood fever. Our parents died within the same year that her illness struck, a carriage accident, sudden and senseless. I was left responsible for an estate I was not prepared to manage, and a sister who had just lost her sight, all while trying to hold together a household that seemed determined to collapse around us. Alina felt something shift inside her chest, a deeper understanding beginning to form of the man who stood before her, so different from the cold, cruel figure who had ordered her removed from the ball weeks earlier. That explains a great deal, she said quietly. Does it excuse my behavior toward you? He asked, and there was genuine uncertainty in the question, an openness that felt strikingly vulnerable coming from someone who had built such careful walls around himself. It does not excuse it, Alina said honestly. But it helps me understand it. The Duke nodded slowly, accepting this without argument, and for a long moment they simply stood together in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken understanding settling gently between them. It was in this silence that Alina first began to suspect, with a flicker of alarm she was not yet ready to fully confront, that her feelings toward this complicated, guarded man had shifted into something far more dangerous than simple curiosity. She did not yet know that this fragile, growing understanding between them would soon be tested by forces neither of them could control, nor that a familiar face from the Duke's past was already making her way back into the county, carrying secrets and ambitions that would threaten everything Alina had begun, cautiously and against every warning, to hope for. The name arrived before the woman did, carried through the estate on a wave of hushed servant gossip that reached Alina's ears within days of her next visit. Lady Charlotte Ashby was returning to the county after nearly 2 years abroad, and according to Clara, who delivered the news with a tightness around her mouth that suggested strong feelings carefully restrained, her return was no accident. She has set her sights on the Duke again, Clara said, arranging linens with more force than the task strictly required. Everyone in this house remembers what happened the last time she came sniffing around this estate, broke his trust into pieces and left without so much as a backward glance, and now she comes crawling back the moment she hears his fortunes have grown even larger. Alina absorbed this information carefully, a strange unease settling in her stomach that she could not entirely attribute to simple curiosity. What happened between them? Clara glanced around, as though checking for listening ears before lowering her voice further. She courted him for the better part of a year, back before his parents passed. Everyone believed a marriage was certain. Then she vanished, without warning, without explanation, straight into the arms of a wealthier lord 2 counties over. Broke the young master's heart so thoroughly that he has not trusted a woman's affection since, not truly, not until. She stopped herself abruptly, pressing her lips together. Not until what? Alina pressed. Nothing, Clara said, a knowing look crossing her weathered face before she busied herself once more with the linens, leaving Alina with far more questions than answers. The news settled uneasily over the following days, and Alina found herself unable to shake a persistent, uncomfortable awareness of how quickly things could shift within the Whitmore household. She had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of her visits, the easy warmth of Serafina's friendship, the increasingly frequent, increasingly meaningful exchanges with the Duke himself. The sudden reappearance of a woman from his past, a woman who had once held such power over his heart, threatened to unsettle all of it. Serafina, when Alina finally worked up the courage to ask her directly about Lady Charlotte, grew unusually quiet, her fingers stilling against the embroidery she had been working by touch and memory. Charlotte was cruel in ways that were very difficult to see from the outside, she said finally. She was charming, beautiful, everything society expected in a future duchess, but she never truly cared for Alexander. She cared for what he could offer her. When a better offer arrived, she took it without hesitation and left him to pick up the pieces of a heart he had never protected properly in the first place. That must have hurt him terribly, Alina said quietly. It did more than hurt him, Serafina said. It changed him entirely. Before Charlotte, my brother was warm, generous, quick to laugh and quick to trust. Afterward, he built walls around himself so thick that I sometimes wondered if the man I had grown up with still existed underneath them at all. She paused, turning her face toward Alina with unusual seriousness. You have begun to find him again, Alina. I have watched it happen these past weeks, heard it in the way his voice changes when your name comes up in conversation. I would hate to see Charlotte's return undo whatever progress you have managed to make. Alina felt a flush of embarrassment at the direct observation, though she could not deny the truth behind it. I do not know that I have made any progress at all. He has apologized, and we have spoken civilly a handful of times. That is hardly the foundation for anything more significant. Perhaps not yet, Serafina said, a small knowing smile touching her lips despite the seriousness of their earlier conversation. But I have known my brother his entire life, Alina, and I have never heard him speak of anyone the way he has spoken of you these past weeks. Even in the careful, guarded way he allows himself to speak of anything important. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching the sitting room, and moments later, a young housemaid appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless. Lady Charlotte Ashby has arrived, my lady. She is asking to see the Duke immediately. Serafina's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though she recovered quickly, her voice remaining carefully neutral. Thank you, Grace. Please let my brother know. The maid curtsied and hurried away, leaving a heavy silence behind her. Alina felt her stomach twist with an unease she could not fully justify, a strange, unfamiliar protectiveness rising within her that surprised her with its intensity. Perhaps I should leave, she said, uncertain of her place in whatever was about to unfold. No, Serafina said quickly, reaching out to catch Alina's hand. Stay, please. I would feel far better facing this with you here rather than alone. Alina agreed, though a part of her could not help wondering whether her presence would do anything but complicate an already tense situation. They made their way toward the main hall together, Serafina's hand resting lightly on Alina's arm for guidance, and arrived just as Lady Charlotte Ashby swept through the front doors in a rustle of expensive silk and confident perfume. She was, Alina had to admit, precisely as beautiful as the rumors suggested, with golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, and a figure draped in fabric far finer than anything Alina's mother had ever stitched together in her narrow little shop. Charlotte's eyes swept across the entrance hall with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to admiration, before settling, with unmistakable calculation, on the tall figure of Alexander Whitmore, who had just emerged from his study to meet her. "Alexander," Charlotte said, her voice smooth as honey, drifting toward him with practiced grace. "It has been far too long." "Lady Charlotte," the Duke replied, his tone carefully neutral, though Alina did not miss the slight tension that had entered his shoulders, the careful stillness of a man bracing himself against an old wound reopening. "I had not expected your return to the county." "I found myself missing home terribly," Charlotte said, her smile widening as she moved closer, entirely unbothered by the presence of anyone else in the room. "And I confess, I found myself missing certain company here as well." Alina watched the exchange with a discomfort that surprised her in its sharpness, watched the way Charlotte's gaze moved possessively over the Duke, as though she had every right to claim whatever ground she wished to reclaim. She glanced toward Alexander, searching his expression for some sign of how he truly felt beneath his carefully composed exterior, and found, to her quiet relief, none of the softness she might have expected from a man still nursing an old flame. "I trust your travels were pleasant," Alexander said, his tone remaining formal, distant in a way that seemed to catch Charlotte slightly off guard. "They were," she said, recovering quickly, her smile never wavering. "Though I confess I am glad to be home, there is so much to catch up on. I hear you have been quite the recluse these past months, Alexander. Surely you have not forgotten how to properly entertain guests." It was then that her attention finally shifted toward Alina and Serafina, standing together near the base of the staircase, and her expression flickered, just briefly, with something sharp and assessing before smoothing back into polite pleasantry. "And who is this?" she asked, her gaze lingering on Alina's simple dress with a subtle, unmistakable judgment that reminded Alina uncomfortably of the cruel glances she had endured on the night of the ball. "This is Alina Marsh," Serafina said before her brother could respond, her voice carrying a firm protectiveness that surprised even Alina. "A dear friend of mine." "How lovely," Charlotte said, her tone perfectly pleasant, though the slight narrowing of her eyes told a different story entirely. "I do not believe I have heard your family name before, Miss Marsh. Are you newly arrived to the county?" "I have lived here my entire life," Alina said evenly, refusing to let the subtle condescension unsettle her composure. "My mother runs a dressmaking shop in town." Something flickered across Charlotte's face, quick and calculating, before her smile returned, brighter and more dangerous than before. "How charming! It is so refreshing to see the estate opening its doors to such a wide variety of company these days." She turned back toward Alexander, her voice softening into something more intimate. "You have changed, Alexander. I remember a time when this house kept far more careful company." "Times change," Alexander said simply, though Alina noticed the tightness in his jaw, the barely contained tension in his stance. Charlotte studied him for a long moment, clearly recalibrating whatever assumptions she had carried into this reunion, before turning her attention back toward the room at large with practiced grace. "I shall not intrude on your afternoon any further. I merely wish to pay my respects upon my return. Perhaps we might speak more properly soon, Alexander, once you have had time to settle whatever business currently occupies you." With that, she swept back out through the front doors as gracefully as she had entered, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken tension. Serafina let out a slow breath the moment the doors closed behind her. "That woman has not changed one bit," she muttered, her earlier composure cracking to reveal genuine anger beneath it. "Still circling this family like a vulture the moment she catches the scent of something valuable." Alexander said nothing for a long moment, his gaze distant, lost in thoughts Alina could not begin to guess. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him beyond his years. "She has excellent timing, I will give her that." "Do not let her back into your life, Alexander," Serafina said firmly. Whatever she is after this time, it is not affection. It never was. I have no intention of allowing her anywhere near my life again, Alexander said, though something in his tone carried more determination than conviction, as though he were reminding himself of a truth he needed to hold onto firmly. His gaze shifted then, unexpectedly, toward Alina, who stood quietly near the staircase, uncertain of her place in this sudden unraveling of old wounds. For a long moment their eyes met, and Alina felt something pass between them that she could not quite name, something that felt, despite the tension still hanging heavy in the room, like reassurance. "Thank you for staying," he said quietly, the words meant only for her. "Of course," Alina replied, though her heart pounded with an intensity that had little to do with the tense scene that had just unfolded and everything to do with the way he was looking at her now, as though she had become, without either of them quite realizing when it happened, someone whose presence mattered a great deal to him. She did not yet know that Charlotte Ashby's return marked only the beginning of the storm gathering on the horizon, nor that the beautiful, calculating woman would not accept her sudden dismissal so easily. Somewhere behind that practiced smile, plans were already forming, plans that would soon threaten not only Alina's fragile growing place within the Whitmore household, but her reputation, her safety, and everything she had begun, cautiously and against every warning, to hope for. The rumors began quietly, the way poison often does, slipping through the town in whispers that grew louder with each retelling. Alina first noticed the change in the way customers looked at her mother's shop, the way conversations fell silent when she entered a room, the sideways glances that followed her along streets she had walked her entire life without a second thought. It was Margaret who finally told her the truth of it, arriving at the shop one afternoon with a face flushed from hurrying and eyes bright with barely contained anger. "There is talk going around town," she said, closing the door firmly behind her. "Ugly talk about you and the Duke." Alina set down the fabric she had been folding, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. "What kind of talk?" "That you have been sneaking into his household under false pretenses, seducing him for his fortune, using his blind sister as nothing more than a means of gaining access to his bed and his money." Margaret's voice shook with outrage as she spoke the words, clearly finding them as distasteful as Alina did. "Someone has been spreading it deliberately, going from shop to shop, dropping the story into conversation as though it were common knowledge." "Who would spread such lies?" Alina asked, though even as the question left her lips, a name rose immediately to mind. "I do not know for certain," Margaret said, "but I have heard that Lady Charlotte Ashby has been seen speaking with several of the town's most notorious gossips this past week, always finding a way to mention your name in the conversation, always with that same false sweetness in her voice that people mistake for genuine concern." Alina felt anger rising sharp and hot within her chest, mixed uncomfortably with fear. She thought of her mother, whose reputation and livelihood depended entirely on the trust of the community, now threatened by lies designed to punish Alina for daring to occupy space in a world that Charlotte clearly believed belonged exclusively to women of her own status. She thought of Serafina, whose genuine friendship was being twisted into something ugly and calculating by people who had never bothered to understand the truth of it. "I need to speak with the Duke," Alina said, gathering her shawl with trembling hands. "He needs to know what is being said." She made the journey to the estate faster than she ever had before, her mind racing through the implications of what Margaret had told her, the potential damage to her mother's business, to her own reputation, to the fragile trust she had built so carefully with the Whitmore household over these past weeks. By the time she arrived, breathless and flushed from hurrying, Clara took one look at her face and ushered her immediately toward the study, where the Duke was reviewing correspondence at his desk. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting quickly from surprise to concern at the evident distress written across her features. "Alina, what has happened?" The words spilled out of her in a rush, the rumors, the whispers, the deliberate cruelty behind them, and as she spoke, she watched his expression darken with an anger that seemed to burn even hotter than her own. "Charlotte," he said, the single word carrying a weight of contempt Alina had not heard from him before. "I cannot prove it was her," Alina said, though her own certainty matched his suspicion entirely. "You do not need to prove it," Alexander said, rising from his desk with a sharpness that suggested barely contained fury. "I know her methods well enough. This is precisely the sort of quiet, poisonous cruelty she has always favored, striking where it will cause the most damage while keeping her own hands appearing perfectly clean." "What am I supposed to do?" Alina asked, and for the first time since the humiliation of the ball, she felt the full weight of her precarious position settle over her, the terrible awareness that a single well-placed lie could destroy everything her mother had built over decades of honest, careful work. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger before he spoke again, his voice carrying an unexpected firmness. "You will do nothing, because I intend to handle this myself." "Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected, gently but firmly. "After everything that has passed between us these past weeks, I think we have moved beyond such formality. Do you not agree?" Despite the tension of the moment, Alina felt a flicker of warmth at this, quickly suppressed by the seriousness of their situation. "Alexander," she said, testing the name aloud for the first time, "what do you intend to do?" "I intend to remind Lady Charlotte Ashby precisely why spreading lies about the people under my protection is a very poor decision," he said, and there was a coldness in his voice that reminded Alina, uncomfortably, of the man who had once ordered her removed from his ballroom without hesitation. This time, however, that coldness was directed entirely in her defense, and the realization sent an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest despite her lingering fear. True to his word, the Duke acted swiftly. Within days, word spread through the county that Alexander Whitmore had paid a very direct, very public visit to Lady Charlotte Ashby's family estate, and though the exact details of the conversation remained private, the effect was undeniable. The whispers that had grown so loud in town began to quiet almost as quickly as they had started, replaced instead by a new rumor entirely, one suggesting that anyone caught speaking ill of Alina Marsh or her family would find themselves swiftly and permanently out of favor with the most powerful man in the region. Alina felt the shift immediately, the return of polite nods from shopkeepers who had avoided her eyes only days before, the gradual softening of suspicious glances back into ordinary indifference. Her mother's business, thankfully, suffered no lasting damage, though the memory of how close it had come to disaster lingered uncomfortably in Alina's mind. But if she believed the danger had passed entirely, that belief was shattered on a cold evening nearly 2 weeks later, when a hurried messenger arrived at her mother's shop just as they were closing for the night, breathless with urgency. "Miss Marsh," the young man gasped, clearly having run a considerable distance, "you are needed at the estate immediately. Lady Seraphina has taken ill, very suddenly, and she has been asking for you." Alina's heart lurched with fear as she grabbed her shawl and followed the messenger back out into the cold night air, questions racing through her mind faster than she could voice them. By the time they reached the estate, she found the household in a state of quiet chaos, servants hurrying through corridors with worried expressions, a physician's carriage already stationed outside the main entrance. Alexander met her at the top of the staircase, his face pale and drawn in a way that struck fear deep into Alina's chest. "She has a fever," he said without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled worry. "It came on suddenly this afternoon, and it has only worsened since. The physician says—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, and Alina felt a chill of recognition settle over her, understanding immediately the terror he must be feeling, the memory of the fever that had already stolen his sister's sight once before, now threatening to take something far more precious. "Take me to her," Alina said quietly. He led her without hesitation through the darkened corridors toward Seraphina's bedchamber, where the young woman lay pale and restless against her pillows, her breathing shallow and uneven. Alina felt her chest tighten painfully at the sight, all the warmth and easy laughter she had come to associate with Seraphina now stripped away, replaced by a fragile stillness that terrified her far more than she had expected. "Elena," Serafina murmured weakly as Elena approached the bed, reaching out a trembling hand that Elena took immediately, holding it firmly between both of her own. "I am here," Elena said softly. "I am not going anywhere." The physician, an older man with tired eyes and a gentle manner, explained quietly to Alexander that the fever would need to run its course, that all they could do now was keep her comfortable, keep her cool, and wait to see whether her body proved strong enough to fight through it. The words carried an unspoken weight that hung heavy over the room, a reminder that not everyone survived such fevers, that Serafina herself carried the physical evidence of exactly how dangerous they could be. Elena did not leave the estate that night, nor the following day, remaining at Serafina's bedside through long, exhausting hours, changing cool cloths against her fevered brow, murmuring soft reassurances whenever the young woman stirred restlessly in her sleep, humming, without quite realizing she was doing it, the same wordless tunes her mother always said accompanied her while she worked. Alexander remained close as well, though he insisted, whenever Elena tried to convince him to rest, that he would not leave his sister's side while her fate remained uncertain. It was during the long, dark hours of the second night, when the household had finally quieted into an uneasy stillness, and even the most devoted servants had succumbed briefly to exhaustion, that Elena found herself alone with Alexander in the dim candlelight of Serafina's room, both of them watching over the fragile, sleeping figure between them with matching expressions of quiet, desperate hope. "You did not have to stay," Alexander said softly, breaking the long silence that had settled between them. "Of course I did," Elena said without hesitation. "She is my friend. I could not have stayed away, even if I had wanted to." Alexander studied her for a long moment in the flickering candlelight, something raw and unguarded moving across his face that she had never witnessed from him before, not even in their most honest conversations. "I do not know how to properly thank you for what you have done these past 2 days," he said, "nor for everything you have done for her these past months." She has not laughed so freely, has not seemed so genuinely happy in longer than I care to admit, not since before the illness took her sight. She has given me far more than I could ever give her in return, Elena said honestly. Her friendship has meant more to me than she probably realizes. "And what of me?" Alexander asked quietly, the question hanging heavy in the candle-lit air between them. "What have I given you beyond humiliation and apology?" Elena hesitated, unsure how much honesty the moment could bear, though something in his expression, exhausted and vulnerable in a way she had never seen from the proud, guarded man who had once ordered her thrown from his home, convinced her to answer truthfully. "You have given me the chance to see beneath the reputation everyone warned me about," she said softly. "A man far more complicated, and far more capable of genuine feeling, than the cold duke the entire county believes you to be." Something shifted in his expression at these words, a fragile, hesitant hope flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. He reached out slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently took her hand in his own, the same hand that had spent the last 2 days tending so devotedly to his sister. "Elena," he said quietly, her name carrying a weight and tenderness that sent her heart racing despite the exhausted, frightened circumstances surrounding them. "I do not know what the coming days will bring for Serafina, and I know this is not the proper time to speak of such things. But I find that I can no longer pretend the feelings that have grown within me. These past months are anything less than what they truly are." Elena felt her breath catch, torn between the overwhelming worry still gripping her heart for Serafina's fragile condition, and the equally overwhelming realization of what Alexander was trying, so carefully and vulnerably, to tell her. Before either of them could say anything further, a soft, weak voice interrupted them from the bed. "Finally," Serafina murmured, her eyes fluttering half open, a faint, exhausted smile touching her pale lips. "I was beginning to think I would have to catch this fever a second time before either of you found the courage to say something honest to each other." "Serafina," Alexander said, immediately releasing Alina's hand to lean forward toward his sister, relief flooding his voice at the evidence of her improving strength. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Serafina admitted, her voice weak but steadier than it had been in days. "But better, truly better, I think." Her unfocused eyes drifted toward where she knew Alina was sitting, and her smile widened slightly. "Thank you for staying with me, Alina. I heard you, even when the fever kept pulling me under, your voice, humming those little tunes of yours. It helped more than you probably realize." Tears of relief pricked at Alina's eyes as she leaned forward to gently squeeze Serafina's hand once more. "I am so glad you are feeling better." As the physician was summoned once more to confirm the improvement, and the household slowly began stirring back to life with the cautious hope of good news finally arriving, Alina found herself catching Alexander's gaze across the room, the unfinished conversation between them still hanging in the air, fragile and unresolved, but carrying now the quiet certainty that it would, eventually, find its proper conclusion. Neither of them could have guessed, in that moment of exhausted relief, just how soon that conclusion would be tested by a far more dangerous storm than fever or gossip, one already gathering force in the shadows just beyond the estate's protective walls. Serafina's recovery continued steadily over the following days, her strength returning with each passing hour, her laughter once more filling the quiet corridors of the estate in a way that lifted the entire household's spirits. Alina finally allowed herself to return home for proper rest, though she found her thoughts constantly drifting back toward the unfinished conversation with Alexander, the tender, unspoken promise that had passed between them in the candle-lit stillness of Serafina's sick room. She did not have to wait long for that promise to resurface. On a crisp morning nearly a week after the fever had finally broken, a carriage arrived outside her mother's modest shop, drawing curious stares from neighbors along the narrow street. Alina's heart leapt into her throat as she recognized the crest painted upon its door, and moments later, Alexander himself stepped down, dressed simply, without the usual formal trappings of his station, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had never witnessed from him before. "Your Grace," her mother said, hurrying forward with a hasty curtsy, clearly startled by the unexpected visit. "Please," Alexander said gently, "there is no need for such formality. I have come to speak with Alina, if she is willing." Alina's mother glanced between them, understanding dawning slowly across her tired features, before she offered a small, knowing smile and retreated quietly into the back of the shop, leaving the two of them alone amid the bolts of fabric and half-finished gowns. "I did not expect to see you here," Alina said, her heart racing despite her attempt at composure. "I could not wait any longer to finish what I began saying that night," Alexander said, taking a step closer, his usual guarded composure entirely absent, replaced by something rawer, more honest than she had ever witnessed from him. "Alina, these past months have changed something within me that I did not believe still existed. I built walls around my heart so long ago that I had convinced myself I no longer needed anyone beyond my sister's affection. And then you walked into my ballroom, and though I treated you abominably that night, I could not stop thinking of you afterward, could not shake the memory of the honesty in your voice, the strength with which you held your ground against my cruelty." Alina felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as he continued, his words tumbling out with an urgency that suggested he had been holding them back far too long already. "You have shown my sister a friendship more genuine than anything money or status could ever buy," he went on. "And you have shown me, slowly and patiently, despite every reason I gave you to walk away entirely, that trust is not always a foolish risk. I do not know how to properly express how deeply you have changed me, Alina, except to say plainly that I love you, and I would be honored beyond words if you would consider allowing me the chance to prove myself worthy of that feeling." For a long moment, Alina could not speak at all, overwhelmed by the sincerity behind his words, by the memory of every small kindness and difficult moment that had led them both to this unexpected point. "Alexander," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion, "after the way we first met, I never imagined I would hear such words from you. Nor did I imagine I would ever wish to say them, he admitted, a small, hopeful smile touching his lips. But here we are. Here we are, Alina echoed, and found herself smiling despite the tears still gathering in her eyes. I love you too, Alexander. Despite every warning I received, despite every reason to guard my heart against a man of your position and reputation, I could not help falling for the person you truly are beneath all of it. The relief and joy that broke across his features in that moment transformed him entirely, stripping away every trace of the cold, guarded Duke the county had come to fear, revealing instead the warm, generous man Serafina had always insisted still existed underneath. He reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them needed any further words at all. Their happiness, however, would not remain uncontested for long. Word of the Duke's visit to the humble dressmaker's shop spread through the county with predictable speed, and while many reacted with genuine warmth, having witnessed enough of Alina's character over recent months to trust the match, others reacted with the same cruel skepticism that had marked her first disastrous night at the ball. Chief among these skeptics, unsurprisingly, was Lady Charlotte Ashby, whose earlier attempt to destroy Alina's reputation through gossip had failed thanks to Alexander's swift intervention, but whose wounded pride had only grown more dangerous in the weeks since. It was Clara who first brought warning of Charlotte's latest scheme, arriving breathlessly at Alina's shop with news that sent a fresh chill of alarm through the household. She has been telling people that you trapped the Duke through deception, Clara said, wringing her hands anxiously. That you used Lady Serafina's illness as an opportunity to manipulate his emotions while he was most vulnerable, that your affection is nothing more than calculated ambition dressed up in false humility. Alina felt her stomach twist at the accusation, though this time, armed with the certainty of Alexander's genuine love and the strength of Serafina's unwavering friendship, she found herself less frightened than determined. She will not succeed this time, she said firmly. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not allow her lies to make me doubt what Alexander and I have built together. Nevertheless, the rumors proved more persistent this time, fueled by Charlotte's careful cultivation of sympathetic ears among the county's more influential families, families whose support Alexander needed to maintain his position and reputation. Matters came to a dangerous head when Charlotte, growing desperate as her whispers failed to achieve their intended effect, resorted to a far bolder and more reckless scheme entirely. She arranged, through means Alina never fully discovered, to have a forged letter delivered to Alexander, purportedly written by Alina herself, containing damning admissions of deliberate manipulation and calculated ambition, phrased in language crafted specifically to wound him in his deepest, most vulnerable insecurities about trust and betrayal. The letter arrived on the very morning Alexander had planned to formally announce their engagement to the assembled county gentry, at a gathering hosted specifically for that purpose. Alina arrived at the estate that afternoon, dressed in the finest gown her mother had managed to complete for the occasion, only to find the atmosphere thick with a tension she could not immediately explain. Servants avoided her eyes as she passed through the corridors, and when she finally found Alexander in his study, his expression carried a coldness she had not witnessed since the very night they first met. Alexander, she asked, alarm rising sharply within her at his unreadable expression. What is wrong? He said nothing at first, simply extending a folded letter toward her without meeting her eyes. Alina took it with trembling hands, and as she read the cruel, calculated words attributed falsely to her own pen, her horror grew with every line. This is not mine, she said immediately, looking up to meet his gaze with desperate sincerity. Alexander, I did not write this. I would never write such things, none of it is true. The handwriting appears remarkably similar to your own, Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled, though Alina could hear the pain beneath the careful composure, the old wound of Charlotte's original betrayal clearly reopening beneath this fresh assault on his trust. Someone has forged it, Alina said, desperation creeping into her voice as she recognized, with sickening clarity, exactly whose hand lay behind such a cruel and elaborate deception. Charlotte has done this, Alexander. She has failed to destroy me through gossip, so now she seeks to destroy your trust in me directly, through means far more dangerous. You would say that regardless of the truth, Alexander said, though his voice wavered slightly, betraying the uncertainty warring within him. Ask Serafina, Alina said suddenly, gripping his arm with fierce determination. She knows my voice, my honesty, better than anyone else in this household. Let her judge whether these words could possibly belong to me. Something in her desperate certainty seemed to reach him, cutting through the fog of old wounds and fresh doubt clouding his judgment. Together, they made their way to Serafina's sitting room, where she sat calmly working at her embroidery, entirely unaware of the crisis unfolding around her. Read it to her, Alina said, thrusting the letter toward Alexander. Let her hear the words directly and judge for herself. Alexander hesitated only a moment before complying, reading the cruel, calculated accusations aloud in a voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Serafina listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the reading continued, until finally, when he finished, she shook her head firmly. This is not Alina, she said with absolute certainty. I have spent countless hours listening to her speak, to her laugh, to the particular rhythm of her honesty. These words carry none of her warmth, none of her genuine care. They are calculated, cold, deliberately cruel in a way Alina has never once been, not even when she had every right to be after the humiliation you first put her through, Alexander. This is Charlotte's work. I would stake my very life on it. The certainty in her voice seemed to finally break through whatever doubt Charlotte's cruel scheme had managed to plant within Alexander's heart. He turned back toward Alina, his expression flooding with shame and relief in equal measure. Alina, I am so sorry. I should never have doubted you, not even for a moment. You were hurt once before by someone wearing exactly this kind of mask, Alina said gently, understanding the fear beneath his brief lapse of faith even as relief washed through her own trembling body. I cannot fault you entirely for that fear, even as it wounds me that you believed it possible, if only briefly. It will not happen again, Alexander said firmly, taking her hands once more, this time with a fierce determination that left no room for doubt. I will find proof of Charlotte's deception, and I will ensure the entire county knows the truth of her cruelty, so that she can never again threaten what we have built together. True to his word, Alexander's investigation, aided by careful questioning of servants, and a comparison of Charlotte's own handwriting against the forged letter's careful but ultimately imperfect imitation, revealed undeniable proof of her scheme within days. When confronted with the evidence, Charlotte's careful composure finally shattered entirely, and she departed the county in disgrace, her reputation destroyed far more thoroughly than any lie she had ever attempted to spread about Alina. With the threat finally neutralized, Alexander and Alina's engagement was announced properly at last, the delayed gathering rescheduled with even greater fanfare than originally planned, as though the entire county wished to make amends for having ever doubted the genuine love that had grown between them despite every obstacle placed in its path. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation, joy, and the occasional lingering nervousness that still gripped Alina, whenever she considered exactly how far her life had traveled from the narrow little shop, where she had spent her childhood folding fabric and stitching hems alongside her mother. The county, once so quick to judge her unworthy of the Duke's ballroom, now buzzed with excitement over the upcoming union, though Alina suspected more than a little of that enthusiasm stemmed from simple curiosity rather than genuine warmth. Not that it mattered to her any longer. She had learned, through everything the past months had thrown at her, that the opinions of a crowd meant far less than the steady, unwavering support of the people who truly knew her heart. Her mother, initially so cautious about the entire situation, had gradually softened into genuine happiness as she watched her daughter's transformation, though she never quite lost the habit of reminding Alina to remain grounded, regardless of how grand her new life might become. "You will always be my daughter first," she said one evening, as she carefully fitted the final adjustments to the wedding gown she had insisted on making herself, refusing every offer from the estate's tailors to take over the task. "Duchess or not, do not ever forget where you came from, or the value of the hands that taught you to see people for who they truly are rather than what they wear." "I could never forget that," Alina promised, embracing her mother tightly amid the half-finished silk and scattered pins. "Everything I am, everything that drew Alexander to me in the first place came from you." Serafina, meanwhile, had taken to her role as an enthusiastic advisor for every aspect of the wedding preparations, with a delight that filled the entire estate with renewed energy. She insisted on being present for every fitting, every discussion of flowers and music, offering opinions based on textures and scents, and the particular quality of laughter certain choices produced in the room around her. "This fabric," she said one afternoon, running her fingers along a length of pale gold silk Alina had been considering for the ceremony's decorations, "feels like sunlight. I think it is exactly right." "You have quite the talent for choosing things you cannot see," Alina said, laughing warmly. "I have simply learned to trust senses other people overlook," Serafina replied, smiling. "It has served me rather well these past months, would you not agree? After all, it was my hearing that first recognized something worth saving in you, long before my brother's eyes managed to see past his own foolish pride." Alexander, overhearing this exchange from the doorway, offered no argument, simply a rueful, affectionate smile that had become far more common on his features in recent weeks than the cold, guarded expression Alina remembered from their first disastrous meeting. The transformation in him continued to astonish everyone who had known him before, servants remarking quietly to one another about how the estate itself seemed brighter, warmer, filled with a laughter that had been notably absent for years before Alina's arrival. Not every challenge had entirely dissolved, however. A handful of the county's more stubborn aristocratic families continued to voice quiet disapproval of the match, unable to fully release their attachment to rigid ideas about status and bloodline, regardless of the evident happiness and genuine character Alina had demonstrated time and again. Alexander addressed these lingering objections with a directness that left little room for argument. "I have spent my entire life measuring people by the standards this county taught me," he told a gathering of skeptical neighbors during one particularly tense dinner party held weeks before the wedding. "Wealth, title, bloodline, all the careful markers we use to decide who deserves respect and who does not. Alina taught me, through nothing more than her own quiet honesty, how deeply flawed that measurement truly is. I would rather spend my life with a woman of genuine character and no title than with 100 women of impeccable bloodline and empty hearts. If that troubles any of you, I am afraid you will simply need to adjust your expectations, because my decision on this matter is entirely final." The directness of his declaration, delivered with the same commanding authority that had once ordered Alina thrown from his ballroom, silenced even the most stubborn objections, and gradually, as the wedding date approached, the county's skepticism gave way to genuine anticipation. The story of the ruthless Duke transformed by love into something the entire region seemed eager to witness firsthand. On the morning of the wedding itself, Alina stood in a small antechamber adjoining the estate's grand chapel, her mother making final adjustments to the gown they had worked on together for weeks, while Serafina sat nearby, her fingers gently tracing the delicate embroidery along the sleeves, a small, contented smile never leaving her face. "Are you frightened?" Serafina asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the room. Alina considered the question honestly, remembering the terror she had felt walking into the ballroom all those months ago, utterly certain she did not belong, and comparing it against the steady, quiet confidence that filled her now. "No," she said finally. "I do not think I have ever felt less frightened in my entire life." "Good," Serafina said, satisfaction clear in her voice. "You have earned every bit of the happiness waiting for you beyond those doors, Alina. Never doubt that, regardless of what anyone else might whisper. When the doors finally opened, and Alina walked down the aisle toward the man who had once tried so hard to push her away, she found herself thinking not of the cruel words that had first defined their relationship, but of every small, honest moment that had followed, the roses in the garden, the quiet vulnerability of candle-lit conversations, the fierce determination with which he had defended her against every threat to their happiness. Alexander watched her approach with an expression of open, unguarded wonder, the last remnants of his once impenetrable walls entirely dissolved. As they exchanged their vows before the assembled crowd, Alina caught sight of Serafina seated in the front row, her sightless eyes turned toward the sound of their voices, tears of genuine happiness streaming freely down her face, and Alina felt overwhelming gratitude for the strange, unlikely chain of events that had led them all to this moment. A single act of kindness from a young woman who could not see, extended toward a stranger the entire room had judged unworthy, had ultimately transformed not only Alina's own life, but the lives of everyone connected to it. The ballroom that had once witnessed her humiliation now filled instead with celebration, music and laughter replacing the cold, judgmental silence of that first disastrous night. Alina danced in Alexander's arms beneath the same chandeliers that had once illuminated her shame, and found that the memory no longer carried any power over her at all, transformed entirely by everything that had grown between them since. Years later, when their own children asked about how their parents had first met, Alina would tell the story exactly as it happened: the cruelty of that first meeting, the unexpected kindness of a blind young woman who heard truth where others saw only judgment, and the long, difficult journey toward genuine understanding and love that followed. She never softened the harder parts of the tale, believing firmly that the difficulty of their beginning only made the strength of what they had built together more meaningful. Serafina remained a constant, beloved presence in their household throughout the years that followed, her friendship with Alina growing only deeper with time, and her role as the catalyst who had first brought them together becoming something of a cherished family legend, told and retold at every gathering, a reminder to everyone who heard it that true character could never be measured by appearance alone, and that sometimes the person who sees the most clearly is the one who cannot see at all. The first months of marriage brought their own quiet adjustments, as Alina learned to navigate a life so different from the one she had known before, filled with responsibilities toward tenants and household accounts, social obligations she had never imagined herself fulfilling, and the particular challenge of stepping into a role that so many still watched with careful, curious scrutiny. Alexander proved a steady, patient partner throughout this transition, never expecting her to abandon the practical wisdom and honest directness that had first drawn him to her, but rather encouraging her to bring that same character into her new position. "You do not need to become someone else to belong here," he told her one evening, as she fretted over the proper way to address a visiting dignitary during an upcoming dinner. "The county already loves you exactly as you are. I would not wish to see that change for anything." Her mother's shop, rather than closing as many had expected once Alina's fortunes changed so dramatically, flourished instead under a new arrangement Alina herself had proposed, becoming the primary source of gowns and fine linens for the Whitmore estate and its extended social circle, a partnership that brought her mother both financial security and a quiet, well-earned respect throughout the county that had once dismissed her as merely a tradeswoman. Serafina's own life took an unexpected turn during this period as well, one that brought Alina particular joy given everything her friend had done to bring about her own happiness. A young scholar named Edmund Rayburn, invited to the estate to catalog the extensive library collection, found himself immediately captivated by Serafina's sharp wit and remarkable perception. And unlike so many who had approached her before with careful, pitying gentleness on account of her blindness, Edmund spoke to her as an equal from their very first conversation, challenging her opinions and delighting in her sharp observations rather than tiptoeing around them. "He does not treat me as though I might shatter at the slightest disagreement," Serafina confided to Alina one afternoon, a rare shyness coloring her usual confident tone. "It is remarkably refreshing." Perhaps you have finally found someone whose voice tells you something worth pursuing, Alina said, smiling as she watched her friend's cheeks flush with unmistakable happiness. Perhaps, Serafina admitted, laughing. Though I suspect I have you to thank for teaching me that trusting such feelings need not always end badly. Their courtship, which unfolded over the following months with a gentleness and mutual respect that mirrored, in its own way, the difficult journey Alina and Alexander had traveled before them, culminated eventually in a second joyful wedding at the estate, one attended by nearly the same crowd who had witnessed Alina's humiliation and subsequent triumph, now gathered instead to celebrate the happiness of the household's most beloved member. Alexander, watching his sister exchange vows with a man who clearly cherished every unique quality that made her who she was, found himself overwhelmed with a gratitude he struggled to properly articulate. "I owe you more than I could ever repay," he told Alina quietly as they watched the ceremony together. "Not only for the happiness you have given me, but for the happiness you brought back into her life as well. I do not think either of us fully understood how much we needed you until you arrived, quite by accident, into our world." "It was not entirely accident," Alina reminded him gently. "Your sister chose to call me back that night when everyone else, including you, had already decided I did not belong. Whatever happiness has grown from that decision belongs as much to her courage as to any accident of fate." As the years continued to unfold, the Whitmore estate became known throughout the county not for the cold, unwelcoming reputation it had once carried, but for its warmth, its genuine hospitality, and the remarkable story of transformation that had unfolded within its walls. Alina never forgot the lessons of her humble beginnings, ensuring that the household's doors remained open to people of genuine character regardless of their birth or fortune, a policy that occasionally raised eyebrows among the more traditional families of the region, but which Alexander supported without hesitation, having learned firsthand the folly of judging worth by appearance alone. Their own children grew up hearing Serafina's voice as a constant, beloved presence throughout their childhood, absorbing without quite realizing it the same lessons their aunt had taught their mother so many years before, that true perception required more than simple sight, that honesty and kindness mattered infinitely more than status or wealth, and that sometimes the most important connections in life arrive from the most unexpected directions, if only we remain open enough to recognize them when they call out to us. The ballroom, where it had all begun, remained a favorite gathering place for the family throughout the years, hosting countless celebrations that gradually replaced the memory of that first cruel night with layers upon layers of genuine joy. Alina would sometimes stand near the top of that same grand staircase, where Serafina had once called out so unexpectedly on her behalf, remembering the fear and humiliation of that original moment, and marveling at how completely a single act of kindness had rewritten the entire course of her life. She often thought, in her quieter moments, of how easily things might have unfolded differently, had Serafina remained silent that night, had she simply allowed the crowd's cruel judgment to carry Alina out into the darkness without intervention. The thought never failed to fill her with profound gratitude, not only for the love she had found with Alexander, but for the deep, enduring friendship that had made that love possible in the first place, a friendship built not on sight, but on something far more valuable and far rarer, the willingness to truly listen and to recognize the honest heart of another person, regardless of everything the world might insist should keep them apart. 10 years passed before the county witnessed anything quite so remarkable as the story of Alina and Alexander again, and by then, the tale had softened into something closer to legend than memory, told to newcomers as proof that even the most guarded hearts could learn to open under the right circumstances. Alina, now a mother of 3 and mistress of an estate that had grown more prosperous under her practical guidance, found herself reflecting on those early days with a fondness that had long since replaced the fear and uncertainty that once accompanied them. It was during a visit from her eldest daughter's tutor, a sharp, observant young woman named Lucy Fenwick, that Alina found herself unexpectedly revisiting the full weight of her own history. Lucy had come from modest circumstances herself, the daughter of a village schoolmaster, and had earned her position at the estate through nothing but diligence and genuine talent, much to the quiet disapproval of several neighboring families who still clung to old ideas about proper household staff. "They do not think I belong here," Lucy confided one afternoon, as she and Alina walked together through the same garden where Alina had once spoken so openly with Serafina all those years before. "I hear them whispering when they think I cannot hear, wondering why the Duchess would allow someone of my background near her own children." Alina felt a familiar ache at these words, recognizing in Lucy's uncertain expression an echo of her own younger self, standing humiliated in a ballroom full of judgment. "Let me tell you something, Lucy," she said gently, settling onto the same stone bench where Serafina had once waited to hear her voice for the first time. "I once stood exactly where you are standing now, certain that I did not belong among people who judged worth by birth rather than character. It took the kindness of a single person who saw past all of that to change the entire course of my life. I intend to be that person for you, if you will allow it." Lucy's eyes filled with grateful tears at these words, and from that day forward, Alina made certain that her position within the household remained secure, regardless of whatever quiet prejudice continued to linger among the county's more stubborn families. It became, in time, something of a quiet mission for Alina, extending the same grace she had once received to others who found themselves standing at the edges of rooms they had been told did not belong to them. Serafina and Edmund, meanwhile, had settled into a partnership every bit as devoted as Alina's own marriage, their shared love of literature and sharp, curious minds producing not only a happy home, but eventually a modest but respected published collection of essays that Edmund read aloud to his wife each evening as they worked through revisions together, her keen ear catching awkward phrasing and unclear reasoning long before any sighted reader might have noticed the flaws. "You have become quite the editor," Alina teased her friend during one visit, watching as Serafina dictated corrections with the same confident authority she had once used to call Alina back from the ballroom door. "I have simply applied the same skills I have always possessed," Serafina replied, smiling. "Listening carefully to what people truly mean, rather than merely what they say. It has served me well in matters of love, and apparently it serves just as well in matters of literature." Alexander, for his part, had grown into a very different man than the cold, guarded figure who had once ruled his estate through distance and suspicion. His transformation had not gone unnoticed by the wider community, and in time, he became known throughout the region not merely as a wealthy landholder, but as a man whose judgment on matters of character and fairness carried genuine weight, frequently sought out to mediate disputes between families precisely because of his hard-won understanding that appearances so often deceived. "I spent the first half of my life believing that trust was a weakness," he confided to Alina one quiet evening, as they sat together watching their children play in the very garden where their own unlikely love story had first taken root. "You taught me otherwise, though I confess it took me far longer to learn the lesson than it should have." "You were protecting a wound that had never properly healed," Alina said, reaching for his hand. "I understood that even when your caution frustrated me most. And yet you remained patient with me regardless," he said, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "I do not know that I deserved such patience, but I have spent every day since trying to prove myself worthy of it." As the sun began to set over the estate that evening, casting long golden light across the same garden paths where Alina had once described the color of roses to a woman who could not see them, she found herself struck once more by the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment of quiet, hard-earned happiness. She thought of her mother, still working in the shop that had grown into something of a local institution, proud beyond words of the daughter who had never forgotten where she came from despite the grandeur that now surrounded her daily life. She thought of Margaret, who had gone on to marry a kind merchant and start a family of her own, forever remembered fondly as the cousin whose invitation had set this entire remarkable chain of events into motion. And she thought, most of all, of that terrifying, humiliating moment when a footman's hand had closed around her arm, certain in that instant that her life would return to its narrow, familiar boundaries, the moment she stepped back through those grand front doors into the ordinary world she had always known. She could never have imagined, in that moment of despair, that a single voice calling out from the top of a staircase would unravel every certainty she carried about her place in the world, and replace it instead with a life built on genuine love, hard-won trust, and the unshakable knowledge that true worth had never depended on the opinions of a judgmental crowd in the first place. The ballroom still stood at the heart of the Whitmore estate, its chandeliers still glittering during every grand celebration the family hosted. But it had long since transformed in Alina's memory from a place of humiliation into something closer to a monument, a permanent reminder of exactly how far kindness, courage, and honest character could carry a person, regardless of where they began. Every time she crossed its polished floors, whether dancing in her husband's arms or simply passing through on some ordinary errand, she felt a quiet, grateful echo of that first terrifying night, and the blind young woman whose voice had reached across a crowded room to change everything. Serafina remained, until her final years, the most trusted confidant in Alina's life, their friendship weathering every challenge that time and circumstance placed before it, growing only richer with each passing season. And whenever new guests to the estate asked about the remarkable bond between the Duchess and her sister-in-law, the story was always told the same way, beginning not with wealth or title or grand romantic gestures, but with a single, simple truth that Serafina herself had insisted upon from that very first night. That the most honest voice in any crowded room is rarely the loudest one, and that sometimes it takes someone who cannot see at all to recognize the truth that everyone else has overlooked entirely.